Hi, everybody. My name's Madeline, and I am the Youth Programs Coordinator at the Idaho Federation of Families. And I am here with Kayla Steinman, who is an attorney in the Youth Unit at Disability Rights Idaho. And today, in this video, we will be talking specifically about confidentiality as a minor when in treatment for a past sexual trauma. In our video, Confidentiality and Mental Health Sessions, we discussed that if you are over 14, providers must generally keep the statements made during mental health sessions confidential. However, one of the exceptions to this rule, an exception that allows mental health providers to break confidentiality, is when mandatory reporting laws apply. So today we are going to talk about confidentiality in treatment of sexual trauma. So my first question for you, Kayla, is what are Idaho's mandatory reporting laws?
So Idaho's mandatory reporting law is a specific law created for the protection of minors. It requires specific people to report when they are made aware of child abuse. Every state has their own mandatory reporting laws. In Idaho, the law requires all people who are considered mandated reporters to make a report either to law enforcement or CPS when they have reason to believe that a child under the age of 18 has been abused, abandoned, or neglected.
So a mandatory reporter is required to report abuse, abandonment, and neglect. Does this include sexual abuse?
Yes, it does. Sexual abuse under this definition includes rape, molestation, assault, incest, prostitution, pornographic content, statutory rape, and other forms of sexual exploitation. These are what the statute itself considers sexual abuse of a minor. There may be other things that come to mind here, like sexual harassment, stalking. Those aren't listed as abuse under the statute, but they may be considered abuse if so extreme as to cause psychological or emotional harm to the victim or to put them in physical danger. So if someone has reason to believe that a child has been sexually abused, they are required to report it under Idaho law.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for explaining that. So tell me more about mandatory reporting laws. Who is required to make these reports?
So under Idaho law, mandatory reporters are any physician, resident on a hospital staff, intern, nurse, coroner, school teacher, daycare personnel, social worker, or other person. The inclusion of the word other person in this law means that every person is required to report. This means it includes school counselors and your parents and even your therapist or anyone you're speaking to during a mental health session. It even includes you technically as a minor. We're all mandatory reporters under Idaho's mandatory reporting laws. This means that if during a mental health session, you tell your therapist that you or any other child has been abused, they, as a therapist, are required to report it to law enforcement or CPS. Notice that this law does not require that they tell your parents. They are only required to report the abuse to law enforcement or CPS. However, your therapist has ethical obligations to disclose confidential information to protect you or others from harm. For example, if you tell your therapist about someone abusing you and that someone still lives in the same house as you and is a threat to your safety, your therapist would be required to report it to CPS or law enforcement, and they also may be required to tell your parents in order to protect you from that person who is causing you harm. If someone is a mandated reporter and they somehow find out that a child has been abused, they're required to report it.
What do you mean by has reason to believe? Why would someone have to report that they have reason to believe that a child has been abused?
What I mean by has reason to believe means that the person is made aware of the abuse somehow, enough so that it would be reasonable for them to believe that the abuse occurred. This could be by you or someone else telling them. It could be by them seeing the abuse occur or seeing the effects of the abuse. Let's say, for example, that a child comes to school with a lot of strange bruises on their body and is looking beat up in a way that is more than just them falling on the playground. Their teacher, seeing these bruises, would likely be required to make a report. In that scenario, the teacher was not told that the child was being abused. They didn't know for sure that the child was being abused, and they didn't know who caused the bruises. But the evidence is so strong enough to suggest that the abuse might be happening, that they would likely be required to make a report in that situation. When it comes to reporting sexual abuse of a child, the mandated reporter is more than likely going to have to rely on pieces of information that form their belief. Sexual abuse often happens in the home, but it could really happen anywhere that's private. More than likely, though, it's not exactly somewhere people can directly witness it happening. So if a minor tells a teacher that they have been sexually abused, the teacher now has reason to believe that abuse occurred, enough so that they know for sure that they would have to report this.
Thank you. How should someone talk to their therapist or counselor about sexual trauma if they don't want it reported?
So the reason that we have this law that we require people to report child abuse is for the safety of children. We as a society value keeping children safe, and that is why people aren't really given a way out of reporting this information if they get it. The law doesn't say mandated reporters are required to report abuse unless the child doesn't want it. It's important to understand that if you talk about past abuse in mental health sessions, your counselor must report that. However, as we discussed, this doesn't necessarily mean that your parents will find out. They might, and probably will, if that person who harmed you is still present in your life and they need to know for safety reasons. But if this is an abuse that happened like years and years ago, that person is no longer in your life, it's not like an exact necessity that your parents will find out. The best way to approach this topic in a mental health session is to ask your counselor or therapist about it. Say, hey, something may have happened to me that I want to talk about with you. However, it's really private and sensitive to me, and I would like you to go over confidentiality with me. What stays private between us? If you ask your therapist that, they're going to go over everything with you and make sure that you feel safe and okay and comfortable with whatever it is you might have to share. So if you or someone you know has had sexual trauma, it is important that you or they get help and talk to a professional. If you are concerned about confidentiality and privacy in these sessions, you can always ask your provider to walk through the process with you and ask any questions that you may have.
That's super helpful. Thank you. What if a friend discloses to me that they have been sexually abused or assaulted? What should I do?
So under Idaho law, every person is a mandatory reporter, including yourself. So if your friend's under 18, public policy in Idaho would have this information be reported to Child Protective Services. The most important thing in the situation is to provide support for your friend. Definitely advise them to seek treatment and let them know about mandatory reporting laws when they do. Depending on the age of the minor victim, it is important to give them agency and choice, especially because they just went through something so horrific where all agency and choice was taken from them. The victim or survivor may choose to not report. And if something they are describing is ongoing and a present danger to them, meaning they are at high risk of this abuse happening again, you should really consider telling your therapist and getting some counsel on the situation, or telling a trusted adult.
So, when someone makes a report of child abuse or neglect to CPS or law enforcement, what happens next?
So after a report is made, CPS will review the information and determine if an investigation is needed. If they determine an investigation is needed, the CPS worker may talk with the family, they may talk with the child, or other people to determine what is making the child unsafe. They may work with the parents or caregivers to get social services, education, or other types of assistance to them. Basically, though, not every report becomes an investigation, and not every investigation is determined by CPS to have enough evidence to be called true.
So, in summary, everyone is a mandatory reporter in Idaho, including your therapist or counselor. And this means that if someone learns about the sexual trauma of a child, they are obligated by law to report it to CPS or law enforcement.
Sounds right.
Thanks, Kayla.
All right, have a good day. Bye.
See you.